The air was heavy, seething, and for a brief moment, the South China Sea forgot how to breathe. Somewhere on the horizon, the rumble of engines sounded like distant thunder, a fleet awakening beneath the surface of the darkness. It was not the storm itself that disillusioned the world, but the silence that preceded it. Because on this night, machines would stop working, circuits would stop working, and the fate of nations would depend not on satellites or sensors, but on the fragile courage of men who could still see through the chaos. In the age of machines, it was the heart that saw first. October 3rd, 2025. In the darkness of the South China Sea, the world's most contested body of water, a giant silhouette looms. The aircraft carrier Shandong, leading a group of predatory destroyers and frigates. Their prey, Freedom Rig, an American energy fortress, the beating heart of Washington's technological presence in Asia. That night, the darkness will burn and the sky will turn black. The clock struck 3:15 in the morning. From the eastern horizon, the darkness rippled and then tore apart. 10 red comets streaked across the night, their trails carving fire into the clouds. Within seconds, the silence of the sea was replaced by a symphony of engines, static, and thunder. The Shandong cut through the swells like a black leviathan. Around her, 6 Type 05, 2 destroyers and 4 Jiangkai frigates formed a ring of steel, advancing in perfect silence. Above them, 5 Y-9 electronic warfare aircraft opened their bellies, unleashing jamming waves across the spectrum, 120 gigawatts of electromagnetic fury. The air itself began to scream. Radar signals collided, distorted, and died. The South China Sea's electronic sky turned into a blinding white sea of noise. Every pulse, every echo, every reflection, gone. Inside the Freedom Rig's command room, the ANSPY-6 radar array flickered once. Then, black. The heartbeat of the outpost flatlined. Screens turned to darkness. Alarms failed to sound. For a moment, the only lights came from the red emergency bulbs, pulsing like dying stars. "Sirida, offline," shouted a young officer. Colonel James Marston did not reply. He stood still, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the void in front of him. 2 decades of battle had taught him to fear not the enemy, but silence acts, because silence meant you were already too late. Another wave of interference swept across the rig, shaking the walls. The first detonations echoed from afar, distant, uncertain, like thunder over a drowned world. Somewhere out there, the Chinese bombers were diving, guided by invisible hands through a storm of static. Marston's hands slammed against the table. "Switch to manual mode," he commanded, his voice like the crack of steel. "If the machines are blinder, then fight with your eyes." That order shattered the paralysis. Men and women leapt from their seats, racing through narrow metal corridors. On the deck, searchlights cut through smoke and sea spray. Marines armed with shoulder-fired stingers, laser rangefinders, and thermal sights took position along the railings. Their equipment was simple, outdated by modern standards, yet, at that moment, it was all they had. Above them, missiles streaked closer, silver blades against the black canvas. Without radar, there were no systems to guide them, no digital angels whispering where to aim. Only instinct, only the human pulse. In the dark, someone whispered a prayer. The first explosion erupted 2 miles away, a distant bloom of light on the water. The second came closer. And then, the third. The Freedom Rig was no longer a fortress of technology. It had become a lighthouse of men, surrounded by the roaring tide of an invisible war. The command traveled through the metal like thunder. "Fight with your eyes." Those words struck every Marine like an electric surge. It was madness, but also the only truth that made sense when machines had gone blind. Private Sanchez climbed the outer ladder, his boots clanging against steel. The wind tore at his uniform, salt cutting into his face. In his arms, a single Stinger launcher, old but reliable, the kind he had trained with under blistering sun for endless months. "Thermal sight online," shouted Corporal Reeves beside him, scanning the horizon. "No radar echo, sir. We are on our own." Sanchez adjusted the sight, his breath misting against the eyepiece. The ahead glowed in ghostly tones, out engines, cold water, metal moving beneath the clouds. 10 missiles, low-flying, slicing through the humid air at supersonic speed. He could not hear them, but he could feel them like a tremor in the bones. Range? 400 yards, closing fast. Marston's voice echoed through the comm. "Steady, all stations. Trust your sight. Trust your pulse." And then Sanchez saw it, a faint streak of red arcing towards the rig like a demon's tongue. His finger tightened. The world narrowed into a single breath. He fired. The Stinger leapt from the tube with a scream that cut through the sea's roar. A blinding flash followed, an instant later, a Chinese missile worth $2 million turned into a ball of white fire. The shock wave punched the air, fragments rained into the sea. "Hit confirmed," Reeves shouted. Cheers erupted along the deck, but Marston's voice sliced through the comm. "No celebration. Next target, 2 o'clock." They reloaded, fired again, another, and another. Missile after missile lit the sky, bright arcs tearing through the fog. The air was filled with thunder, the smell of burning fuel, the metallic taste of ozone. Soldiers shouted coordinates, their voices rising above the chaos, not guided by data, but by instinct honed through pain and repetition. 5 minutes passed. 9 of the 10 incoming missiles were gone, shredded, swallowed by the sea. The rig trembled, but it still stood, proud and defiant. Then came the 10th. A flash, too close, too low to intercept. The explosion hit the water less than 300 yards away. A blast wave slammed into the structure, shattering windows, hurling men to the floor. Sanchez was thrown back, his helmet striking the railing. His ears rang. All he could hear was a dull hum. Through the haze, he saw Corporal Reeves crawling, blood trickling down his cheek. Others screamed for the medic. Smoke billowed across the deck, carrying the bitter stench of burning metal. Marston appeared through the haze, face streaked with ash. He crouched beside the wounded, his voice steady, though the deck still trembled beneath their boots. "Hold the line," he murmured. "Hamp, you've done more than any machine tonight." Overhead, the sky burned with fading trails of light, the remains of destroyed missiles drifting like dying stars. For a moment, no one spoke. The men stared into the darkness they had survived, the silence after fury. In that silence, something changed. They were no longer operators behind screens. They were the eyes of a blind fortress, the last pulse of a living defense. And from that point on, the war was no longer between machines. It was between will and extinction. At 4:02 in the morning, Washington awoke to red corridors. Phones rang in unison across the Pentagon, screens blazed with the words, "South, China, Sia, contact, lost." Within minutes, the Situation Room filled with uniforms and quiet fury. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs spoke with a voice like thunder kept behind glass. "Confirmed strike on Freedom Rig. Source, People's Liberation Navy Task Force." This is not an exercise. The president's reply came in a single order: retaliate, immediately. No speeches, no hesitation. Across the Pacific, hidden beneath layers of silence, 2 nuclear submarines stirred. USS Louisiana and USS Ohio. In the darkness of the Philippine Trench, their hatches groaned open. 20 Tomahawk missiles were armed, guidance codes verified. "Launch sequence, Alpha pattern," whispered the commander of the Louisiana. "May the sea forgive us." From the deep, pillars of fire rose. Tomahawks broke through the surface in waves, trailing white fire across the horizon. Each missile carried the weight of a nation's anger, streaking towards the enemy fleet like vengeful stars. Above the ocean, 3 EA-118G Growler aircraft sliced through the clouds, their jamming pods glowing faintly blue. They broadcast a digital storm, a sonic hurricane that shredded enemy communication, twisting signals into static snow. The Chinese radar arrays blinked, froze, then fell into darkness. For a moment, both sides stood in mutual blindness, technology devouring itself. But the retaliation was not over. From Guam's silent runways, squadrons of night shadow drones took flight, followed by a swarm of iron bees, as small, fast, and merciless. 300 unmanned machines, each no larger than a man, carried a single promise to end what had begun. At 4:36, the swarm descended upon the sea like rain forged in metal. They dived through tracer fire, weaving between explosions, each one guided by an algorithm but moving as if possessed by instinct. The PLA's defenses roared awake. HQ-9 missiles launched in dense volleys, streaking upward in burning arcs. On the destroyer's decks, experimental laser turrets swept the skies, cutting down drones with surgical precision. The heavens turned into a forest of flame, red, green, gold, reflected in the black mirror of the ocean. But for every 10 drones destroyed, 4 found their mark. The first hit a radar tower, a burst of light and smoke. The second tore open a missile magazine, scattering fire like molten snow. The third dived into the Shandong's flight deck, carving a wound across its steel heart. Inside the carrier's command bridge, alarms wailed. Officers shouted into dead microphones, trying to command a fleet that no longer heard them. The air smelled of burning insulation and salt. "Contain the fire," someone screamed, but no one could. From space, the satellite feeds showed the South China Sea glowing like dawn, an entire quadrant of ocean illuminated by explosions. Back on the Freedom rig, Colonel Marston stood at the railing, his uniform tattered, face illuminated by distant fire. He watched the sky flash again and again and whispered to no one, "Balance has been restored." The wind carried his words into the waves. The night exploded into color. From horizon to horizon, the sky above the South China Sea had turned into a furnace. The sea reflected its own destruction, a shimmering canvas of flame, metal, and ghostly smoke. Within the inferno, chaos reigned. The iron bees and night shadows continued their descent, dodging lances of light and walls of shrapnel. Lasers carved through the sky, turning air into plasma. The HQ-9 missiles rose like spears, leaving spirals of fire behind them. The Chinese fleet fought not a battle, but a storm, an orchestra of destruction where every note was pain. Enemy drones at bearing 070. A voice cry from a destroyer's bridge. Deploy decoys. Switch to point defense. But commands came too late. One drone, spinning through smoke and debris, struck the destroyer's magazine. The explosion was not sound but force, a blinding dome of light that swallowed the ship whole. For a heartbeat, the vessel stood framed against its own death, then split apart. Fire poured into the sea like blood from an open wound. The Shandong took the next hit. 4 tomahawks pierced her deck, one after another, burrowing deep before erupting. 60,000 gallons of jet fuel ignited in a single heartbeat. A column of flame climbed hundreds of meters into the sky, painting the clouds in molten orange. On the deck, parked J-15 fighters turned into torches, wings folding like paper under the blast. Crews ran shouting, but the heat melted steel and silence alike. The carrier's control tower toppled, slow, majestic, inevitable. Inside, Admiral Chen staggered through smoke, clutching the handrail. Seal the hangar. Stop the fire from reaching. A secondary explosion interrupted him. The corridor behind collapsed. The Shandong, once the pride of a nation, now burned as a beacon of defeat. Far above, the surviving growlers circled, their sensors watching the destruction unfold. Each pilot spoke in whispers, not triumph but awe, as if witnessing the birth of a new, terrible dawn. These modern military equipment, one of them murmured, were meant to protect the world, not bury it. His words hung over the comm, unanswered. By 4:55, the Dragon Fleet's formation had disintegrated. 2 destroyers sank, another listed, its hull twisted beyond repair. The sea burned with thick black oil, stretching 9 miles wide, glowing like a scar across the earth. Distress calls crackled over the frequencies. "We've been hit!" Fire spreading. "Request immediate assistance." But no support came. The jamming waves still raged, silencing every plea. On the horizon, the Freedom rig still stood battered, smoking, yet upright. Its silhouette shone against the dawn like a monument of defiance. Colonel Marston lowered his binoculars, exhaustion carving lines into his face. Around him, the surviving Marines tended to the wounded. He looked at the young faces, soot-streaked, eyes hollow yet burning with something that refused to die. "Look," he said softly, pointing to the distant flames. "That's not victory. That's what happens when men forget why they fight." No one answered. Only the sea replied, waves whispering against steel, carrying embers of war into the deep. And as the last fire on the Shandong flickered out, dawn broke pale and silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Dawn rose like a hesitant promise. The South China Sea, once ablaze, now lay silent, a graveyard of twisted hulls and drifting shadows. Smoke curled upward in thin grey ribbons, dissolving into the pale sky as if the night had been a fever dream. The Freedom rig still stood, blackened but unbroken, its antennas bent, its decks scorched, yet its flag fluttered in the morning wind. Around its base, lifeboats drifted, some empty, others carrying the wounded. The water glimmered with oil and blood, each ripple a reminder of what had been lost. Colonel Marston stood at the railing, coat torn, eyes fixed on the horizon where the last fires burned faintly. He whispered to himself, "They blinded the sky, but they could not blind the will." Behind him, the surviving Marines worked in silence. No cheers, no shouts, only the quiet rhythm of those who understood the cost of survival. News reached Washington by sunrise. The official statement was brief, almost cold. The United States did not start this war, but if attacked, we will end it. Yet beyond the politics, beyond the iron and circuits, something deeper had been revealed. The world had seen that even the most advanced military equipment could fail when stripped of its human soul. Machines could execute, calculate, and destroy but they could not believe. For all their precision and power, no military equipment could replace the steadiness of a soldier's heartbeat, the decision made in the dark by courage alone. And perhaps, Marston thought, watching the sea turn gold under the rising sun, the truest military equipment was not built in factories or forged in laboratories. It was born within men who refused to surrender to silence. He turned away as the first helicopter appeared on the horizon, its blades scattering the morning mist. Somewhere, beneath the hum of the engine, the sea whispered the same word it always did after war, a word too fragile for history, but strong enough to start again. What happens when the eye of war becomes blind? The sea lay still, swallowing the moonlight as if holding its breath before an approaching storm of steel.